Well, thanks. Welcome, everybody, to the beginning of our fall meetings. And this year we have, as always, a wonderful list of presenters to bring forward. Hope everybody's had a great summer. And as I mentioned in my piece in Limelight, that you got out and not only enjoyed the summer, but maybe enjoyed some historical sites and all that Kingston has to offer. We will be doing a couple things at this meeting. First of all, having a wonderful presentation by Peter about ourselves, which is rather interesting. So I'm going to keep my comments brief, and I'm going to ask Duncan if he would please come on and introduce Peter so we can listen to the presentation.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. And as Paula said, welcome to the first of our fall lectures. Before I should first perhaps allay the rumor that our speaker tonight is 131 years old. That is simply not the case. He's a youngster, in fact, by this measure. But he is venerable in many other ways, and that is Peter Gower. Peter came to Kingston after a long career as a high school principal. And he, since coming here, has embraced the local history and heritage of Kingston in a very vigorous way. As a historian, he has studied the city and reported it. I would highly recommend to all of you, if you have not already got a copy, or if you are new to Kingston, his volume, Kingston in 150 Pictures. It is a wonderful book, thoroughly researched, giving us 150 glimpses of the history of this city, each accompanied by a very well-written vignette of where that sits in the context of our history. So that's Kingston in 150 Pictures, available at Novel Idea. Peter has also been the editor of Historic Kingston. Now, as anyone who has been an editor will know, being an editor is no fun whatsoever. And Peter has done this with diligence, with perseverance, and a very fine touch, which an editor needs to polish many things. And that often, unfortunately, means dealing with authors who are either late or recalcitrant or just downright not fun to deal with. So Historic Kingston, I think, is one of the premier local history journals in the country today, and that is largely thanks to Peter. And lastly, Peter has proved to be a very able legalist for the society. As we'll hear later tonight, he has crafted the new bylaws that we will hopefully pass later in the evening. And that has been dealt to us by the Ontario government that has mandated a new running laws for nonprofit organizations. And Peter has got us to this doorstep tonight and done it very nicely. So tonight he is going to draw on all three of these lines of expertise to look back on this society and its evolution over, yes, 131 years, really a remarkable achievement. So Peter, thank you for coming, and there you go.
Oh, thank you very much, Duncan. You can just confirm that you can see me and see my first screen and hear me?
I certainly, yes.
Oh, good. And it's nice. I didn't have to come anywhere. I'm just sitting at home. I'd forgotten that this is what happens when we can't go to Kingsbridge. Anyway, thank you for those words, and I hope I can live up to them. One of the reasons for the founding of the Kingston Historical Society in 1893 was to preserve records and documents for future reference. And the first 60 years were well related by President Louis Flynn in Historic Kingston in the mid-1960s. And the records of the Society are all preserved, mostly preserved in the Queen's Archives. And in addition, Flynn kept a remarkable scrapbook from 1951 to 1966, which I'll show you later, and I have used as source material. So this is the minute book used from 1893 until the mid-1960s. You can see it's a huge book, and it's now in the Queen's Archives. and I hope it gets photographed at some point because it is not in the greatest of condition. However, how they carried that to each meeting, I don't know. You know the width of the desks in the archives, and as you see, the book is about this, almost the same height as one of those desks. But today I'm not going to be giving you a detailed year-by-year account of the society. Instead, I'm going to suggest answers to 3 questions. Why was the society founded? What has it done in its 151 years? And what will it do in the future? Indeed, we should ask, is there a future? Now, my grandchildren express disbelief when I tell them that for the first 3 years of my life, I slept in a metal-roofed Quonset-style hut in the side of a hill in our garden, or under a table with a reinforced iron sheet on top, as a precaution against bombs, rockets, and crashing friendly aircraft. The reason: we lived in the midst of 3 RAF fighter stations, Croydon, Kenley, and Biggin Hill. We're here. This is about 15 kilometers. This is somewhat less than 15 kilometers. And air activity would get heavy during the Battle of Britain, and then we were in the pathway of incoming V-1 rockets and V-2 missiles later in the war. Now, despite similar news stories today, that experience is far beyond their imagination, that Grandpa could be involved in such things, or indeed that Grandpa could ever have been a baby. And all of you probably have childhood memories, even if you do not have as disbelieving grandchildren. And I suspect that those men, and they were all men, who met in Queens on October 27th, 1893, also had memories and disbelieving grandchildren. Their average age was 50, but there were amongst them those who were then my present age. So if I'd been there in 1893 and had always lived in Kingston, I would, as a child, have met the last survivors of the original Empire Loyalists who'd arrived a mere 40 years before. I would have met people of color who'd been brought here and lived here as slaves. I would have known John MacDonald, a town alderman and newly established lawyer, and I would have followed his successful progress in life to become the Prime Minister of Canada. And as a child, the idea of a country called Canada would have seemed ridiculous to me. Think to your own childhood and remember what you assumed was impossible: being virtually unable to smoke a cigarette except at home or outdoors, answering a phone call anywhere, watching this talk today or to any time in the future from anywhere in the world on a device you keep in your pocket. And even Dick Tracy couldn't do that. I believe that it may have been the death of our local Member of Parliament in 1891 and his laying in state and burial here that made citizens realize that Kingston had a history that had not been fully recognized because there was no group to organize the remembering. They knew that centennials like that of Kingston becoming a British town or the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists had not been fully acknowledged. They knew that history was not just what happened to them in their lifetime. So the Queen's Journal of December 1893 notes with pleasure the formation of an historical society in Kingston. Perhaps no place in all of Canada, unless it be Quebec, is richer in historical associations than the Limestone City. It would be of incalculable value in years to come to have an accurate account of the business and social life, even of the present time. And notice that the writer uses account rather than interpretation. A second article congratulated Mr. R.M. Horsey on his foresight and noted that everyday documents are often better than official papers at showing what really happened and should be preserved. So an organizing meeting was held in the Senate Room of Queens with 12 all male present, and they agreed to call a public meeting 2 weeks later in the City Council chamber and 25 men attended. Who were they? Well, basically a select group of upper-class male professionals would be the simple answer. We know most about Adam Short, then aged 34. Arthur Lower, the historian, later wrote about him. He was born near London, Ontario, educated at Walkerton High School, where I once taught, and at Queen's, where I did not. He graduated with a gold medal in philosophy in 1879, returned to Kingston in 1885, and by 1891, he was a professor of political science. In 1898, he was our 6th president for a year. In 1906, he was elected to a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and in 1918 became the chairman of the Board of Historical Publications, an adjunct to the Canadian Public Archives. In our first 11 years, he read 13 papers to the Society and got into a fierce public argument with Professor Ferguson, his past president, whose paper on LaSalle he thought was far too pro-French. He certainly had his own opinions, and Arthur Lower, who saw and talked with Dr. Short practically every day, noted that he had the reputation of the best hated man in Ottawa. Back in 1893, a motion was passed and a society called the Historical Society of Kingston was formed. 2 weeks later, a constitution was approved and the annual fee set at $1, about $36 today, so your fees really have not increased out of hand, and with life membership at $10. In January 1894, 3 committees were set up to look after military, ecclesiastical, and civil history, respectively. The city clerk asked the society to look after the establishment of a city museum, and from this we see where the interests of the society would initially lay. In February, the first female is in attendance, with 2 more coming in March. The question of a museum would linger for many years. The acceptance of women was immediate. The meeting place was changed to St. George's Hall and would stay there for many years. 63 papers were given to the society in the first 13 years, 51 of them by one of the 10 presidents. Hope you're listening to that one, Paul Charbonneau. 27 of them were specifically on Kingston, with a further 13 on Canada, and other topics ranged from the United States, the French in North America, Europe before westward emigration, the military, and Australia. Only 3 were on individuals, the Reverend John Stewart, Bishop Strawn, and Lord Sydenham. Meanwhile, the Society was looking around Kingston, marking historical sites, photographing buildings, and that, of course, was a new thing to do, and wondering about that museum. They finally chose Ontario Hall in City Hall, which is where council now meets, as their preferred site, but then there was little response from the council. And these activities are very similar to today's activities, although the quest for a museum has stopped. Ironically, while Kingston still does not have a civic museum, it has more museums, I believe, than any other city in Canada, each specializing in a particular topic. By 1896, that's within 3 years, the original enthusiasm was faltering, and the meeting night was changed from Friday to Tuesday to help encourage matters. But what was encouraging was the interest shown in the society by individuals and groups outside of Kingston. There was not enough money to publish the papers presented, though some do appear in the Queen's Quarterly, and at the end of 1896, the Treasurer reported, as you see here, a balance of $12.25, about $456 after inflation. But it was not all plain sailing. In 1900, the AGM was abandoned for lack of a quorum, and when it was finally held in 1901, the Treasurer announced that now the finances were not in very good condition. Part of the problem may have been that meetings were held on the 3rd week of the month, with the AGM just before Christmas. The Society tried to attract members by advertising meeting in the newspapers. Miss A. Moore became the assistant secretary. Females' Christian names are never given, by the way, or rarely given, and the first female to be on the executive. And in 1901, Miss Gildersleeve became a vice president, but declined the presidency the next year. And the society would have to wait another 70 years for its first female president. However, she was associated with something called the Frontenac Historical Society, which would disappear before the First World War. In 1902, we hear of the first suggestion of writing a history of Kingston, a project which would take 10 years to complete. Agnes Mulmaher, whose father was rector of St. Andrews and a past principal of Queen's, who had a number of historical novels to her credit, noted that she was working on a history of the city, and since, quote, no member had sufficient leisure to undertake the work of collaborating with the gifted authoress, she was given a free hand to write what became the story of Old Kingston. But in 1905, with the death in office of Colonel Twitchell, the society seemed to become dormant for 6 years. While Dr. R.V. Rogers is nominally president, no meetings are recorded in our minute book until 1911. However, at the annual general meeting that year, it was noted that the minute book, lost since 1905, had been found in the vault of St. George's Cathedral, and so meetings are recorded again. In December, a dozen interested people met to resurrect the society. J.M. Farrell became president, and Miss Mahar one of the 2 vice presidents. And within a year, there were 73 members, which suggests that the interest was present, just not the leadership. Along with the lecture series, there were now 4 activities: erecting historic plaques, publishing pamphlets of historic interest, trying to acquire Simcoe House, then on Queen Street and believed to be where Governor Simcoe held his first executive meetings, and the publication of the story of Old Kingston. And for the next 75 years, this would remain the definitive history of the city. And while it shows all of the colonial prejudices of 1912, it remains a remarkable achievement of telling how Kingston changed from being a First Nations meeting place to being a Canadian city. And of course, it's worth remembering, as I said at the start, that if not her, then people she could talk with would have remembered those early days. Meanwhile, Canon Starr had been researching the early records of St. George's Cathedral, and with the help of Dr. A.H. Young of the University of Toronto, published the Parish Register of Kingston, Upper Canada, 1785 to 1811, which looked in greater depth at individuals in Kingston. And Starr and Young surely would be amazed if they knew that 100 years later, their work was available on a searchable CD-ROM, making it an easy to use and very useful research tool. The First World War meant no public meetings after the 1914 series, which raised $100 from the Red Cross. But the objectives of the society were still on the minds of those who stayed in Kingston, and perhaps those fighting far away thought of what they would do when they returned. In 1919, Major General Sir Archibald Macdonnell, who had commanded the 1st Canadian Division since 1917, became the first Canadian Commandant of the Royal Military College and soon was our president. The first 4 meetings, and I don't know if you can read this little bit down here, included what I did in the war talks, General Allenby's campaign in Palestine, the medical services, and Greece in the Great War. Then serious membership recruitment drive took place, possibly trying to help veterans reintegrate into society after their war experiences. And these letters were individually typed in the days before electronic storage. And this, as you see, signed by Macdonnell, going to Brigadier General King. I'm enclosing herewith your membership card at the Kingston Historical Society. And basically, can you tell me how many blank tickets I shall send to you for you to get more members? And he replies, 25 will do that. And there we have King replying to Mac Donnell's request. And that's the ticket that you got. This is the 1923 ticket. And you got, presumably you couldn't get into the lecture without one, and it was torn off. And that's how you got to your 5 lectures. These letters are all individually, when you became a member, the letters were all individually replied by Mac Donnell. We are greatly in need of men of action in this society, men with strong minds, great hearts, true faith, and ready hands. And I shall look forward to you taking an active and prominent part in the life of the organization. No sitting back and not doing anything. So Mac Donnell set 3 objectives: more historic markers, acquiring a museum site, and celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of Fort Frontenac. He hoped to produce an historical pageant for the anniversary, with the city's cooperation, of course. Well, the city offered 5,000. He asked for 5,000, and the city offered 5,000 on condition that the society raised the remaining 15,000. And that idea was rather quickly abandoned. The cost of the markers proved to be much higher than expected, but a museum site was finally found. As you know, in the 1840s, the British had finally decided how they would defend Kingston from an attack by the United States. The 4 Martello towers were built on the lakefront, and with no war, the towers were either abandoned or used for domestic military purposes. Mac Donnell put his eyes on the one in McDonald Park, occupied by the British and then Canadian troops for much of the later part of the century and then abandoned. And there had already been discussions during the war with the Department of Militia to turn the tower into an historical museum for all of Eastern Ontario. When the roof blew off in a storm in September 1922 and killed a boy on his way home from school, the government knew it had to do something. Mac Donnell used his influence to persuade the society to offer to lease the tower we see down here in the minutes from the Federal Department of the Interior. And he would have received help, and Duncan pointed this one out to me, from our treasurer, Oscar Skelton, a Queen's professor of political science and economics, who a couple of years later would move to Ottawa and become one of Prime Minister King's most trusted advisors. The item above this in the minute book is an interesting one. It reads, in cooperation with the Kiwanis Club, Queen's University, and District Military Headquarters, Captain W. McCullough was brought to lecture on the Bolshevik persecution of Christianity. There was an audience of several hundred in Grant Hall, but the lecture was a complete disappointment. An inspection found the tower's basic structure sound, but decayed wooden floors and much military rubbish. The society started a cleanup and collected items of interest to display. It opened during the Old Boys Week of 1925 and has opened every summer since. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So here we have the tower in 1904. This is about as when it opened, guarded by its cannon. And there is the lease, 1925 lease. And I don't know if you can see it, for $1. I think we pay, Pete, again, is it $100 now? Something like that. He can confirm that or tell me later that it was wrong. Now, 1923 had seen the membership at a new record of 118. There were 7 lectures, 4 historic markers were erected. The Ontario Historical Society met at Queen's, and the bank balance was up to $823. And the Society also tried to start its own publication of talks given to the members, since the newspapers did not want to seem to print them. So it's really a magazine called Reports and Proceedings, although it's more reports of what happened in the year, was published, an annual report on the 30th year of the Society. It noted that 3 lectures were printed in full, and here are the lectures here: the Negro migrations to Canada, the tombs and temples of Egypt, Western trails and pathfinders, an Indian city through foreign eyes, the discoveries of Jacques Cartier, how our English ancestors lived, and some historical facts on the Near East question. 3 of those were reprinted. 3 were the Kingston Standards report that was used, and the others were noted as being either extemporaneously or using the reflectoscope for illustrations and therefore could not be reproduced. This actually would be the only edition of Report and Reflections, unfortunately. And although Matt Donnell would live in Kingston until his death in 1941, he gave up the presidency when he retired from RMC in 1925, despite the Society passing a resolution hoping that he would long continue as president. For the Diamond Jubilee of Confederation in 1927, the Society spent $30 for a float in the July 1st parade, continued running the Murney Tower, erecting historic markers and holding meetings with lectures. Simcoe House was saved and later moved to Upper Canada Village, where I believe you can still see it today. And in 1936, the Society received permission to give guided tours of the then somewhat decrepit Fort Henry to celebrate the fort's centennial, and a junior branch was formed to serve as guides. To celebrate Kingston's centenary as a city, the Society commissioned Edwin E. Horsey to write Kingston a Century Ago, and it's interesting to compare his attitudes with those of Agnes Mahar 30 years previously. But numbers of meetings were diminishing, and it was decided to concentrate efforts on activities instead, which proved to be a poor move. From 1938 to 1951, the minute book is blank, and there were no meetings. Now, there was activity. Most, of course, were far more concerned with the war now raging around the world. The Society survived because of the determination of Lieutenant Colonel Cortlandt Strange. He was age 72 when war broke out, and he became acting president on the resignation and subsequent death of R.G. Trotter in 1941. Strange kept the Murney Tower running and open each summer. Richard Preston would later note Strange's knowledge and interest in Kingston's history was somewhat limited to that of his own family. And today, on the left-hand screen there, a Society plaque on the Barrack Street Food Basics store marks the site of the family residence. But his real concern was the Murney Tower. And Preston continues, the tower displayed any item presented to it, without regard to the exhibit's actual historical value. A prominent feature at that time was a stuffed barn owl. But he had discovered a way of making the tower profitable. After the weekly wartime band concerts at the neighboring Cross of Sacrifice, he opened the museum to the public, and it took in a large number of modest entrance fees. And Colonel Strange had accumulated a considerable sum in the KHS bank account that he controlled. Unfortunately, surviving records do not show just how large that nest egg was when he died, but he was not interested in expanding the Society's activities. In 1948, Richard Preston and George Stanley were 2 of the many appointed to the teaching staff at the reopened Royal Military College, and they discovered the state that the Society was in. The resurrection of the Society is best told not in the Secretary's minutes, but in a letter Richard Preston sent to the Society, this letter, in 1993. I already quoted a little bit from it, thanking it for his Gold Life membership card. He noted that there were only 2 members in 1949, Edwin Horsey, now he said was an extinct volcano, but whose father had been a founding member, and Cortlandt Strange, KHS's permanent president, who only had the tower in his mind. Now, while Preston was new to Canadian history, George Stanley was a Canadian history specialist and really wanted to revive the society. Historian Arthur Lower was unable to help solve the problem, but finally Stanley realized that Colonel Strange would listen to senior military authority. And Stanley found that in the RMC commandant, Brigadier D.G. Agnew, who was sympathetic to the objectives of the society. Again, RMC to the rescue. And in 1951, a most distinguished meeting was held in the officers' mess. As well as Strange, there were present Brigadier Agnew, Commandant and aide-de-camp to the Governor-General, George Stanley, who had become president of the Canadian Historical Association, a member of the Massey Commission's Committee on Historic Sites and Monuments, and a founding member of the Archaeological and Historic Sites Board of Ontario, and who would help design the Maple Leaf and then become Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick. Richard Preston, who would write numerous history books and become W.K. Boyd Professor of History Emeritus at Duke University, and Ronald Way, who had already worked on the restoration of Fort Henry and would be involved in many others, including that at Louisbourg. After the latter four had paid their dues to become legal members, that meeting changed the course of the society. Strange was confirmed president and would remain so until his death, age 91 in 1958, to be succeeded by the dynamic Louis Flynn. Stanley became treasurer and opened a new bank account. Other executive members, and this is quite an interesting executive, were Brigadier Agnew, Kingston Mayor Curtis, Ronald Way, and Professor J.A. Corrie, the future principal of Queen's. I would love to have heard a council discussion with those people present. And by mid-October, Stanley could report 64 members. A new constitution was approved, all of 251 words. The 2024 version tonight is about 2,800 words long. And the 1951 revenue was $179. Historic Kingston was started under the probable editorship of Richard Preston. It's not noted in it, interestingly enough, and the first three contributors, Preston, Stanley, and I'm trying to think who the third one is, Way on Fort Henry. The Society received an Award of Merit from the American Association for State and Local History in recognition of its recent burst of vigor, which has won it a recognized place as the local society making the greatest contribution to the appreciation of history in any such organization in Eastern Canada. 11 plaques had been erected in the city by 1957, and the society had been controversially involved in saving 113 Johnson Street. The federal government had planned to demolish the house to provide a rear entrance to the new federal building on Clarence Street, which includes the post office, still there today. Secretary Stanley wrote to William Henderson, our Liberal member in Ottawa, that it is these stone buildings which give Kingston a distinctive character and which breathe life into our history. In the rest of Ontario, there is not very much of this. 2 weeks later, a petition with 310 names was sent. Henderson, in reply, noted that public opinion is rather divided on this subject, as the society knew from at least one letter. It seems to me that the Kingston Historical Society, including numerous Johnny-come-latelys, is in a ridiculous dither about preserving the old stone house at 113 Johnson Street. This edifice has little architectural merit, and the only historical interest it possesses is that for a number of years in the less recent days of Kingston, it was a well-known house of ill repute, run by one Tilly Bennett. Another small item of possibly coincidental interest is that a Negro was once arrested in the house for indecent exposure at one of its upstairs front windows, opposite the rear of Notre Dame Convent. Yours truly, an older Kingstonian. The building, as you know, survives today. The Society was also involved in controversy when, following the annexation of Kingston Township, the Old York Road west of the traffic circle was renamed Princess Street. The City of Toronto has never seen fit to change the name of the Kingston Road, wrote Ron Bruce of Robert Bruce Limited, department store, and an alderman. Ronald Way pointed out that it was only known as the Old York Road for a short way, and then had been known as Dundas Street after 1812 and as the Danforth Road before that. And there was only one dissenting vote to the renaming motion at the 1957 AGM. In 1962, Marjorie Simons noted that we were no longer following the Constitution cobbled together hurriedly in 1951, and a new version, 8 pages long, with no less than 10 aims, was approved. And in 1962, we also became incorporated with letters patent issued by the Ontario government, because the federal government would no longer rent buildings to unincorporated groups. Now, we've already seen the Society's interest in the threatened demolition of 113 Johnson. More interest in history and heritage was started by the action of the city in 1957, taking down the pillars in front of City Hall. The next year, the city formed a special committee to advise on methods of preservation, because there were massive plans to redevelop, indeed destroy, much of Sydenham Ward. David Gordon talked about that a few years ago. And within a few years, many of its members concerned about built heritage had founded the Frontenac Historic Trust, now the Frontenac Heritage Foundation, concerned solely with the preservation of built heritage. And soon the Cataraqui Archaeological and Research Foundation, concerned with what was under the ground, was also founded. Such was the interest in heritage that in 1968, our MPP, Sil Apps, successfully introduced Bill 7, an act reflecting the City of Kingston into the Ontario Legislature to help preserve heritage buildings. It was the forerunner of the 1975 Ontario Heritage Act. Kingston had taken the provincial lead in respecting and celebrating the past, and it has never looked back and has been well supported by individuals and groups, and almost all of this can be traced to the work of the Society or of its members in other groups. In 1964, the Society cooperated with the Whig Standard to produce an illustrated guide to historic sites and monuments of Kingston and District. Margaret Angus became the first female president in 1972, at a time when interest in the heritage of Kingston was probably at its greatest, and we had over 500 individual members. Why this interest? Well, wartime service undoubtedly had created a love of Canada as a country. The centennial of the country had been celebrated, to be followed here by the 300th anniversary of the arrival of the French in what would become Kingston. And there was much excitement created by the tercentenary, but the Society planned the publication of a book focusing on important aspects of life in Kingston, To Preserve and Defend, edited by Gerald Tulchinski, would be published in 1976 with 18 essays. And KHS member Ian Wilson, later Dominion archivist, proposed a resource centre for local studies with photocopies and tape recordings. Remember those things? And microfilm and posters aimed at school children. That proposal did not succeed, but there was an underlying fear that Kingston's heritage was about to be destroyed unless somebody like KHS showed greater interest. Incidentally, Wilson is one of only 5 of those 500 members who I believe is still with us, though there may be more. Neither he nor Jack Pike have maintained membership, but Jennifer McKendry and John Grenville and Neil Patterson have. And new ideas emerged. In 1979, a workshop for school teachers and the public was planned. And despite a slow early response, there were 214 participants, and that event would lead to future exhibitions and competitions and the now very popular History Fair. And as we see from here, you may well be able to recognize various names from 45 years ago: Jennifer McKendry, Doug Stewart, John Spur, Brian Osborne, Marjorie Simmons, Jennifer again, John Grenville. Our people were active and have remained so. We found enough volunteers in the summer of 1981 to keep the McLaughlin Woodworking Museum open when the original property's sale threatened its existence. We planned for Ontario's bicentennial, though celebrations of this throughout the province fell rather flat. And the oft-repeated comment President Ray Hazelwood noted, too few members were willing to assume responsibility, though an exhibit was successfully arranged for display at Kingston Mills Lock. Perhaps Hazelwood failed to realize that our members and ex-members were busy in so many aspects of historical Kingston. 1985 saw the establishment of a task force looking towards our own centennial and the year 2000 to investigate the decline in membership, whose annual fees no longer covered the costs of the newsletter and Historic Kingston. The treasurer was drawing on the reserves we had accumulated when the membership was 600. The recommendations presented the following year were very generic, and over time, many have been implemented. And interestingly, the summary is probably just about what we might write today. History is booming in Kingston. Tourists flock here to see it. Businesses promote it. Kingstonians care about it. And the report shows that our decline is largely due to our success and of others in promoting history in Kingston. The past strength of the Society has been as a promoter of research, a forum for historical ideas, and a distributor of historic writings. Its future greatness lies in continuing those activities. Now, at about the same time, the Society was reminded by a museum expert, H.W.M. Hodges, of the low quality, poor condition, and its poor storage. But positive work continued: visits to schools, preparations for the remembrance of Sir John A.'s death, support of other historic groups, and consideration of the proposal for a Kingston Heritage Centre. Better storage was found in a room in the Queen's Archives. Many of the archive staff were deeply involved in the Society after an attempt to buy the recently vacated Artillery Park building failed. And while here there was no dramatic change in the Society, there have always been subtle improvements in activities, interests, and concerns for local history, and suggestions for change are often received and reviewed by Council and frequently accepted. 1993 saw the 100th birthday of the Society with a centennial art show of 100 Kingston-related pieces reflecting many aspects of the artist's love of the city in the Wilson Room of the Central Library, and a celebratory Christmas party at the Garrison Restaurant, Fort Henry, with 40 members and guests, many dressed in period costume, plain or Highland evening dress, or military mess dress. You'll remember that the centennial, there was a lot of dress, particularly female dress, and this was reused in the tercentenary, and it would be reused. And I think this may have been about the last time that some of those dresses appeared. A promotion committee was established to double our membership. President Frank Millage wrote to Premier Ray to protest most strongly any suggestion that women be admitted to the ranks of the Fort Henry Guard. I don't think that's on Society letterhead, but there's his long argument. If anybody wants to read it, I'll certainly send you a copy. In that year, we published a series of 16 historical vignettes dealing with local topics, each 4 pages on A4 paper, a wide range of Kingston topics, and often by very qualified authors. Richard Preston here, Lou Grimshaw, and this one where the name just is below the picture is Marie Smith. And the previously mentioned special life membership cards we distributed, though I've never seen one. And the annual awards were established with George Stanley, Shirley Gibson Langhill, and Wallace Beck as the first recipients. 1996, a bicentennial commemoration of Molly Brandt's death was observed, and a contribution was made towards the cost of the cairn at Rideau Crest and a plaque at the lower burial ground. And all the time, there were the regular monthly talks and newsletters and the annual publication of Historic Kingston, but membership had declined to about 220. And there was the first talk of involving other and perhaps more ethnic groups. The Society also got involved in various commemorative coin projects for three reasons. They were fundraisers for various other groups. They raised public interest in historic events, and certain members had expertise and knowledge in the area. And the coins were also legal tender in town until the government changed the law and commemorative coins were no longer the fundraiser they had been. And while there was continuing concern about distribution and publishing costs, the advent of sophisticated desktop publishing and electronic delivery has seriously decreased those costs. The 1968 newsletter would have printed on one of those ink splattering Gestatten machines, was mailed to each member. This is a 2-cent stamp and it's going to New York. I wasn't in Canada at the time, so I'm not sure if they would have been 2 cents in Canada as well or whatever, but it was a costly to send out 600 newsletters each month. This is Then magazine. It was started in 1973 and then became Limelight in 1999. But even in 1995, its editor was suggesting an annual conference instead of monthly meetings, or videos of presentations for distribution to members in that pre-YouTube age. And would amalgamation of the many poverty-stricken historical groups in Kingston be for our mutual benefit? Was the question of the day. In 1998, not necessarily as Millennium projects, the Plaque Committee looked at the 1964 plaque booklet, made an inventory of sites with new plaques, and suggested an updated and renamed and illustrated guide to monuments, memorials, and markers in the Kingston area. And at almost the same time, there was a proposal for some form of history competition among the younger people in the community. This would take 25 years to actually happen, but the competition project was abandoned in December due to the current situation in the schools. And I don't know what that current situation was, but a Millennium grant for $5,000 was received for the book. A researcher was hired, and the idea of an updated listing of the many plaques was approved at the end of the year, and the proposal included producing material suitable for a website. We were getting really modern. And while the original booklet included plaques throughout the Kingston Whig Standard distribution area, the 2000 book would cover only the new city of Kingston. And in February 1999, the Society itself decided to explore the possibility of its own website. In June 1999, new editors for both the newsletter and Historic Kingston were appointed. The first issue of Limelight saw the light of day, but then both editors resigned and left Brian Osborne with the task of picking up all the pieces. In that first issue, at the start of the new millennium, President Desmond O'Meara told council, quote, "KHS shall have to remake itself completely in a modern style for the year 2000. Interest was shown in many ways. The Society had probably been too large and too diverse to continue with 600 members, and I can find no time when the 600 met as a group. There is a photograph of about 200 meeting on the side of the river in Fort Frontenac with Richard Preston giving a Saturday afternoon talk. But its members started to found other groups, and with more specific interests, such as a local branch of the Genealogical Society, a branch of the United Empire Loyalists, and the Marine Museum. And all of these carried on the wishes of our founders, learning more and remembering about Kingston's origins and history. Similarly, when a civic museum was not established, we saw many museums, the penitentiary, looking at the penitentiary system, health, electronics, local schools, scouts, to name just a few. Our society had annual bus trips to places of historical interest and hosted visiting historical societies. The Murney Tower was slowly becoming a military museum of the 1850 to 1900 period, and the society wondered if it had to rid itself of the many accumulated and unwanted items which had been stored in appalling conditions in the Masonic Temple at Wellington and Johnson. Some thought they might become part of a civic collection. The society became very interested in persuading the various historical and heritage groups in Kingston to work together. A Kingston Heritage Alliance with a shared website was created, and in the end, the now very effective Kingston Area Museums grew into its present prominence, something the society should be pleased that it encouraged. And this is not a complete list of all of the members, but it gives you a very good idea of the wide variety that there is. This was also the start of a very productive 15 years in the history of the society. Just as in the 1890s and the 1960s, it was people who gave special life to us, so the millennium saw such members as Brian Osborne, Bob Andrews, John Grenville, Jennifer McHenry, and others who I am quite remiss in omitting, encouraged the support of a series of major books. Ged Martin's Favourite Son, Bob Andrews and Rosalind Art's A Troublesome Birth, Philida Kent's To Build a Good Neighbourhood in Grenville Park the First 50 Years, and to support Margaret Simon's The City of Kingston Portrait Collection, and the Williamsville Book Committee's Williamsville Revisited, and my own Kingston Volunteers' Thing to Do. This may be the last hurrah for society-sponsored books, since the Toronto Metropolitan University announced last week that 60% of its book sales are now digital. Favourite Son is available online, and even in 2008, Kingston Volunteers included a fully searchable CD of the text. We also sponsored the very successful conference Sideshow or Main Event, Putting the War of 1812 into Regional Contexts, a day of 8 20-minute presentations, a dinner, and a keynote speech, all of which were included in the conference booklet that attendees took away with them. And there were the annual trips across the border, up the canal, and into remote Glengarry, to name a few. And while the membership has remained recently at about 200, its interest in local history has not diminished. Usually 8 meetings are held each year with a talk given at each. The topics have changed from those early years, often now contemporary. Annual trips no longer take place, and we have supported no new books for a while, but the years of struggle with the Murney Tower have all disappeared. Because of pressure from the heritage sector in the city, we now receive more funding to maintain and promote the tower and make it a place of both entertainment and learning. Batty Mac, oh, that's Major General Mac Donnell. He was a strange character, known as Batty Mac. Most people, of course, called him McDonnell at first, and he immediately fired them if he was their employer and didn't reinstate them for several days. There's also the story of when his army group reached the end of the Battle of the Somme, Regina Trench, and he stood up and waved his hand and said, "We've got here," and a German sniper immediately put a shot through his arm. And when he picked himself up, he stood up and waved the other arm and said, "You didn't get this one." And the sniper did immediately with his next shot. So Batty Mac would be very pleased to know how his idea will be celebrated after 100 years in 2005, and Cortland Strange must be jumping in his grave. The city remembered us by naming its police horse and then its new snowplow, Murney, and rumor has it that the next city tow truck will be named the Murney Tower. We have electronic and hybrid meetings with speakers in these past years, talking from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Los Angeles, California. And we do not always know where our visitors are viewing from. I hear we have one from Newfoundland tonight even. And all of these would have been unbelievable to our founding members. We have, however, lost somehow the feeling of camaraderie, evident when we met face to face each month, and the ability to have silent auctions and show and tell sessions, and even to sell our books. What I have omitted almost completely so far is the Society's changing relationship with the memory of Sir John A. Macdonald, the city's celebration of the founding of Fort Frontenac, and the country's celebrations of its own founding. The major celebrations of 1991, 1973, and 1967 were not repeated 25 or 50 years later. And I earlier suggested that one of the reasons for the founding of the Society may well have been Macdonald's recent death. A number of the early plaques were to note buildings associated with him. An undated Society flyer from the 1990s notes that Kingston has always had an annual commemoration service. In June 1892, Lady Macdonald visited the grave on the first anniversary of his death. The Macdonald Club of Kingston and the National Conservative Party organised a June commemoration, usually at the graveside, for many years. A major 50th anniversary commemoration was held in 1941 and broadcast from Cataraqui across the nation. James Sutherland, whose first vote had been for Macdonald, heard it in PEI, as clear as crystal. The commemoration was organised by the Conservative Party, and according to the Whig, they had organised such a commemoration year after year. And many present in 1941 had known Macdonald. J.G. Elliott, an 83-year-old newspaperman, recalled how 50 journalists were in Kingston for the funeral and collaborated to make sure that no detail of the event was mixed. But in 1970, the Conservative Party decided it should become a less political remembrance and handed over sponsorship of the event to this society. Since then, the ceremonies have been held at the graveside, at City Park for 2 years, or in Memorial Hall for another 2 years, but have always featured a distinguished speaker. As the 1967 centennial approached, there was much thought as to how the event could be permanently remembered, along with all the parades and fireworks. And perhaps the Society's executive had this in mind when they considered the purchase of Bellevue from Professor J.R.R. Beveridge as a permanent home for the Society. Well, in the planning for the centennial, the government was looking for a permanent remembrance of Sir John, preferably in Kingston, where, unfortunately, he was both peripatetic and spent very little time. 110 Rideau Street had been where he lived longest, but it was considered in the slums. Ironic, since he was born in the Glasgow slums. Ex-Prime Minister Diefenbaker suggested Bellevue House, and Parks Canada bought it and restored it to its 1850 configuration. 1965 saw the 150th birthday celebration for Sir John. The Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and Mrs. Earl Rowe and the Ontario Premier and Mrs. John Robarts arrived on a special train and were met at the outer station by a barouche once used by Macdonald. After a memorial graveside service, they joined President of the Privy Council McKilwraith, Leader of the Opposition Diefenbaker, and our member Edgar Benson, and our own Donald Creighton, the evening speaker, and 258 members and guests at the La Salle Hotel for a banquet in the ballroom. The federal government announced $100,000 to restore the City Hall portico, and the province gave $100,000 to create the Centennial Park in front of City Hall. Robarts also announced the renaming of Highway 401 to the Macdonald-Cartier Freeway, amongst various other financial awards. This was a great time to be in Macdonald's hometown. January the 9th to the 13th, 1967 was Sir John A. Macdonald Week, centred on Macdonald Public School as part of the centennial celebrations. As mentioned in 1971, the Society was asked to take over planning the June 6th commemoration, and with over 500 members and about 100 academic institutions subscribing to historic Kingston, the commemoration became a major affair, broadcast by CKWS, and with the senior boy and girl from each school in Kingston, Frontenac, and Lennox and Addington invited. And all the guests were then invited to visit Bellevue House, completely restored and refurbished in the decor of the period. In later years, speakers have included Flora MacDonald, Donald Swainson, A.R.M. Lower, Stuart Ryan, Brian Mulroney, Hugh Siegel, Peter Milliken, and Bob Ray. with all of the speeches published both in Historic Kingston and in separate volumes. In 2000, there was the further development in the recognition of Sir John, when an annual dinner was inaugurated to celebrate his birthday on January the 15th. It was a formal dinner held in the senior staff mess at the Royal Military College, with the College silver in full use. The Commandant, our local politicians, and well over 100 guests would attend, eat and drink, and then listen to a talk on Sir John by a distinguished person. And as the years went by, a change was noticeable. Our members grew older. They were less inclined to come out to that windswept plain of RMC on what was always seen to be the coldest and snowiest night of the year. And indeed, more and more of them seemed to be further south in January. The cost of the dinner increased. And was there a better way to run a dinner? Well, there really is no other place in Kingston comparable to the senior staff mess, and you could not change his birthday. And slowly, we began to realize that the image of Sir John was changing, and the public believed that our attitude to Sir John was out of date. For me, the change came on the evening of the 2015 dinner, the 200th anniversary of his birth. As president, I was delighted to welcome Kingston-born Supreme Court Judge Justice Thomas Cromwell as our speaker, and to talk to his wife, a daughter of George Stanley. She remembered playing in the Murney Tower moat as a child while Dad worked upstairs. And we were looking forward to participating in a city-sponsored celebration next afternoon in Memorial Hall to celebrate the birthday. So I was surprised when I was asked if I had a part in the morning's ceremonies. We heard nothing about the morning, which turned out to be a highly secure visit by Prime Minister Stephen Harper to unveil the city's restored portrait of Sir John. At first, I felt hurt by the omission of the society, but soon realized that we were perceived as a preserver of the uncriticizable Sir John, a very incorrect view when you look back at the topics of the talks we have had. It certainly shed a light on how Sir John was now perceived. The birthday dinner has now become a more general heritage meeting, this year celebrating 20th century Kingston architects. The graveside remembrance continues, and the Honourable Murray Sinclair spoke on MacDonald in a slightly different light, a more complex image, suggesting how society's views have changed towards him. And his final views remind us that our historical understanding is not set in stone, but needs to be constantly revised. To paraphrase, we must be willing to recognize that our image of the man has not been complete, but it needs to be made complete, that what he did to build this country was at great cost to the Indigenous people of Canada. But it's not just MacDonald. In the August-September volume of Canada's History, formerly the Beaver, Christopher Moore tells the story of Parks Canada, who 10 years ago, decided to seek advice from a researcher who was working for the Kwalendon First Nation in Whitehorse. They wanted a translation for a welcome sign in all 8 languages of the Yukon First Nations. The researcher's answer was simple. You know, it's assuming a lot to assume that Yukon First Nations are welcoming you. Today, Parks Canada is reviewing all of its signage. The plaques at the old Haybay Church and at MacDonald's grave have been, are being reviewed for colonial assumptions, missing perspectives, offensive terminology, and controversial beliefs. The sign the Society erected at Bellevue House has been returned to us as, I believe, inappropriate. It reads, "The architect of Canadian Confederation in 1867 and the first Prime Minister of Canada occupied this house, Bellevue, for a period from 1848. Bellevue House is no longer a well-furnished example of a mid-19th century upper-class urban home, no longer the shrine that John Diefenbaker demanded the government buy." And on this past June 6th, Dr. Stephen Smith explained why it has changed to better explain Sir John. You may or may not agree. Why this interpretation? How will it affect us? In England, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans basically sorted out their differences many years ago. In Canada, most of the predominating government group are settlers, but the traditional groups who still exist have barely retained their powers. In England and Canada, the descendants of the settlers have paid little attention to the traditional powers, but here especially, they may find they need to do so, and this will affect the historical society. So, what of the future? The Murney Tower is now the recipient of grant money undreamed of before. The tower may be difficult or impossible for some to access, but now you can tour it virtually from your own home. Open only in the summer, we now have Halloween and Christmas and March break activities, and paranormal groups visit at night to see if they can contact the ghosts. In 2025, we will celebrate 100 years of our rental, and while we don't have the museum the founders envisioned, we do have a display of militaria showing how the tower was lived in. We have historic documents carefully preserved in the Queen's archives, and we have so many museums around town. And perhaps we will come to terms with how we look on Sir John and on those whose ancestors lived here before the white settlers came. And perhaps there will be a civic museum. There are enough artifacts, relics, displays, papers, and diaries on a wide variety of subjects to fill one. There is an old registry office, empty for 10 years, waiting for an occupant. On a grander scale, the old Whig Standard building on Market Square is empty. Will we take up that challenge? If I'd asked those 12 men in 1893 what 2024 will be like for the society, I wonder what they would have answered. And if I ask you what the society will be like in 2155, I wonder how you would answer. Perhaps this story of the changes and refinements and improvements that have happened over 131 years has encouraged you to look ahead positively. I hope so. And finally, Louis' incredible scrapbook, 25 inches high, 18 inches wide, bound in solid leather. I hate to think how much it weighs. The best thing about this being a virtual meeting tonight is I was going to carry it to Kingsbridge, and Peter Ginn was going to have to carry it in for me. And it's just sitting here. It's a heavy book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was very enlightening, especially for somebody who hasn't been around this society for that long. Is there any questions for Peter? I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Peter. There's a lot of accolades and clapping. That's great. The virtual meeting nomenclature. All right. Sorry, Duncan. Yes, I see your hand up now.
Peter, that was a wonderful walking tour through the history of this organization, and it instilled a great deal of pride in what is achieved, despite the ups and downs. I have a question, though. Gender is very important to historians these days. And Cecilia Morgan at the University of Toronto has written very convincingly that in the late 19th century, local history was the first platform that women were invited into the production of history. It was local, it was maternal, it was busy hands work, etc. And you pointed out that Agnes Moll was perhaps an exemplar of that. But as you pointed out, in 1893, the initial membership of this society was all male.
Yep.
And I think you suggested, and would you agree that that was because there was the shadow of MacDonald, a nation builder, and the fact that Kingston, more than most towns, seemed to have this national connection rather than a local connection. So we were kind of, it seems to me from what you said, an exception to the rule. Men got to write the big history, the Makers of Canada series, etc.
Yeah.
Women did the busy work of the community below it that supported what the men did. It was interesting when you showed us Agnes's book that she dedicated it to the men who built the nation.
Yeah.
So what do you
Yeah.
think?
No, I think you're right. The what I tried to do, and I didn't have enough time to research it, was find out where those original 12 men came from. There were a couple of Anglican priests. There were a large number of Queen's professors, and I'm not sure who the others were, but I think it was a very upper class. I talked about it as being a professional male group. And it took a few years for the women to slide in, and then they slid in, I'm sorry, as secretary and correspondence secretary, and finally it was 10 years before they would even be accepted as vice president. Yeah, I don't know where they were, except, I hate to say it, they were at home looking after the children. You know, it's a very, very male-dominated group, and I think Queens had a part to it. I think one of the best things we did was to get out of Queens, which is, you know, a silly thing to say, but it meant that we were part of the city rather than part of the university.
You noticed in your 12 men in the minutes that George Grant, the principal of Queens, the great muscular Christian, was there, who had written that wonderful 1873 book, Ocean to Ocean. I mean, he was there because Queens and Kingston were part of the nation rather than a community unto itself.
Yeah. And I mean, the Dean of St. George was always there. The Anglican bishop was always there. Both they became presidents within the first few years. It's a very much an establishment. I was pleased at why I picked on the first wonderful when we printed. But he was not the typical one. You know, he got into an argument. You never read of arguments in these meetings. Somebody gives a talk and everybody nods and agrees. But obviously, he and Ferguson got into quite a battle over Ferguson being far too pro-French. And as Lower said, Lower worked with him in Ottawa in the archives, which is why he would say he was the most hated man in Ottawa. But yeah, it's a small select group. And it took a long time. The first membership, if you want to do some research, the first membership list we have is 1923. I didn't show you it, but it's in that publication, the Proceedings publication. They have a full membership list. And it would be interesting to see just who those people are 30 years afterwards. There, of course, William Newland's wife is included, but not him. So by that time, there are more women appearing. But anyway, if anybody wants to do some research, I'll send them that list.
Great. I'm sure we could go on and on, but I'm conscious of time and we do have to do some business here. So again, thank you, Peter, for a great presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. May I remind the members that our next lecture will be on Wednesday, October the 16th, when William Galbraith will come down from Ottawa to tell us about Governor General John Buchan, the famous novelist of 39 Steps, and his connection with Canada and Kingston. Galbraith is the biographer of John Buchan and a seasoned lecturer. So that is October 16th, 7 o'clock. Thank you.